The air around the decommissioned Victorian library known as the Archive doesn't just feel still, it feels predatory. For Elias, a man drowning in debt and desperate for a lifeline, the $200 an hour night shift seemed like a miracle. But the rules of the job are as haunting as the setting, where heavy noise-canceling headphones at all times never speak above a murmur, and ignore the jars of swirling, trapped echoes lining the endless shelves. As the city's neon hum fades behind the rusted iron gates, Elias discovers that silence isn't just a requirement, it's a cage. Deep within the windowless halls, the echoes are beginning to thrash against their glass prisons, and a rhythmic, wet pounding starts to resonate from the basement. On this first night, Elias will learn that some sounds are never meant to be heard, and that the archive doesn't just store secrets, it harvests them. The golden handshake. The fluorescent lights of the downtown diner flickered with a rhythmic hum that felt like a migraine in the making. Elias sat in the corner booth, staring at a crumpled eviction notice until the words blurred into a gray smear. He had exactly $42 in his checking account and a landlord who didn't believe in extenuating circumstances. When he saw the ad on the back of a rain-soaked community flyer, he assumed it was a prank or a typo. Night shift monitor. $200 per hour. No experience necessary. Silence is a virtue. Most people would have seen the red flags. To Elias, those red flags looked like a way to pay off his student loans and finally buy a car that didn't rattle like a skeleton in a dryer. The interview had been even stranger. It took place at 11 p.m. in a building that shouldn't have been there, a towering Victorian structure of soot-stained brick wedged between two gleaming glass skyscrapers. The sign above the door simply read, "The Archive." Mr. Thorne, the manager, was a man who looked like he had been dried out in the sun and then dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. He didn't shake Elias's hand, he simply stared at it as if checking for tremors. Thorne spoke in a whisper so thin it barely carried across the desk. The archive is a repository for things that the world is not yet ready to hear, Thorne had said, his eyes never blinking. We deal in acoustics, residual sounds, historical echoes. Your job is simple. You sit in the monitoring room. You watch the jars. You wear the equipment. You do not, under any circumstances, try to listen to the inventory. Now, standing at the iron gates on his first night, Elias felt the weight of the skeleton key in his palm. It was heavy, cold, and felt ancient. The street behind him was bustling with the typical midnight energy of the city, taxis honking, music drifting from a nearby bar, but as Elias stepped through the gate and closed it, the city noise vanished. It wasn't just muffled, it was gone. He approached the massive iron door. His breath hitched, and his hand shook as he slid the key into the lock. The tumblers moved with a heavy, metallic clunk that echoed deep within the building. Elias stepped into the foyer. The air inside smelled of ozone and old parchment. It was freezing, the kind of cold that seemed to ignore his jacket and settle straight into his marrow. Thorne was waiting in the shadows of the vestibule. He handed Elias a pair of sleek, heavy-duty noise-canceling headphones. They were matte black and felt surprisingly heavy. "Put them on," Thorne whispered. "The silence here is heavy. It can be disorienting for the uninitiated." Elias slid the headphones over his ears. Immediately, the world went dead. He couldn't even hear the sound of his own breathing. It was a sensory vacuum, a void that made his inner ear throb. Thorne gestured for him to follow. They walked through a labyrinth of hallways lined with floor-to-ceiling wooden shelves. But there were no books. Instead, thousands of glass jars of all shapes and sizes sat in neat rows. Some were the size of a thimble, others were as large as a 5-gallon carboy. Inside, faint, wispy ribbons of light, like trapped aurora borealis, swirled lazily. "These are the echoes," Thorne's voice piped into Elias's headphones via a built-in comms system. "Some are harmless." A laugh from 1924. A thunderstorm from the Dust Bowl. Others are more volatile. They require a witness. Your presence acts as a grounded circuit. They reached the central monitoring station, a circular desk surrounded by monitors that displayed nothing but fluctuating wave patterns and thermal readings of the shelves. "3 rules, Elias," Thorne said, his voice crackling slightly in the headset. 1. The headphones stay on. 2. You do not speak above a murmur. 3. If you hear a bell ring from the basement level, you turn the volume on your headset to max, close your eyes, and do not move until the ringing stops. Do you understand? Elias nodded, his throat dry. What's in the basement? Thorne paused, his thin lips twitching into something that might have been a smile, or perhaps a grimace. Feedback. Now, the logbook is on the desk. Every hour, you will walk the east and west wings. If a jar glows red, you mark the shelf number. If a jar is vibrating, you notify me via the intercom. I will be in the sub-office. Thorne turned and vanished into the darkness of the hallway without another word. Elias sat down in the high-backed leather chair. He looked at the clock on the wall. 12:05 a.m. It was a long way until dawn. The silence of the headphones began to play tricks on him. He felt like he was underwater. He picked up a pen to test the logbook, and the scratch of the nib on the paper sounded like a chainsaw in his ears, amplified by the internal microphones of the headset. He winced and put the pen down. He leaned back, watching the monitors. The wave patterns were steady, a hypnotic rise and fall that beckoned sleep. But Elias was wired. The $200 an hour felt less like a wage and more like a bribe. What kind of job paid this much to sit in a room full of glowing jars? As he scanned the room, he noticed a small, handwritten note taped to the bottom of the monitor. It wasn't in Thorne's elegant script. It was jagged, written in a hurry. Don't trust the silence. It's just holding its breath. Elias felt a prickle of sweat run down his spine. He looked toward the east wing, where the jars stretched into the darkness. Somewhere in the vast, still archive, a jar began to pulse with a faint, sickly violet light. His first shift had truly begun. The vibrating void. The violet pulse was subtle at first, a rhythmic throb that matched the pounding of Elias's own heart. He stood up, the leather of the chair creaking like a gunshot in his hypersensitive headset. Following the map Thorne had left, he entered the east wing. The air here felt thicker, as if the oxygen had been replaced by something more viscous. The jars on the shelves were labeled with cryptic strings of numbers and dates. October 14, 1912, sinking, August 6, 1945, flash. Elias tried not to think about what those sounds might be. He found the source of the violet light on shelf 402. It was a small apothecary jar, and the ribbon of light inside wasn't swirling, it was thrashing. The glass felt hot through his gloves. As he reached for his logbook, a low-frequency hum began to vibrate through the soles of his boots. It wasn't a sound, not yet, but a physical sensation that made his teeth ache. He checked the headset. The active noise canceling was working overtime, the green light flickering as it fought to neutralize the building pressure. He realized then that the echoes weren't just recordings, they were energetic entities. If the glass broke, the sound wouldn't just be heard, it would happen. He hurried back to the desk to log the incident, but as he sat down, he noticed the monitors had changed. The steady wave patterns were gone, replaced by jagged, chaotic spikes. He reached for the intercom to call Thorne, but his hand froze. From the west wing, a soft, wet sound drifted through the air. It was a sound his headphones shouldn't have let through. Drip. 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 He checked the ceiling for leaks, but the old wood was dry. The dripping wasn't water. It was the sound of something thick hitting the floor, a sound that felt heavy with the weight of something organic. Elias realized with a jolt of terror that the silence of the archive wasn't an absence of noise, it was a cage. And something was starting to pick the lock. The childhood echo. By 2 a.m., the cold had become aggressive. Elias found himself pacing the small circle of the monitoring station, his breath coming in white plumes. Every time he turned his back on the dark hallways, he felt 1,000 invisible eyes watching him from the reflections in the glass jars. He tried to distract himself by reading the logbooks of previous employees. Most were mundane, but toward the back of the drawer, he found a notebook with a chart cover. The entries were frantic. "It's learning my cadence," one note read. "It's mimicking the way I sigh." Suddenly, the audio in his headset hissed. A burst of static popped in his ears, followed by a sound that drained the blood from his face. "Eli Bear." The voice was faint, distorted by decades of metaphorical dust, but he recognized it instantly. It was his mother's voice, specifically, the way she used to call him to dinner when he was 6 years old, before the accident. "Eli Bear, it's time to come inside. It's getting dark." Elias ripped the headset off. The silence of the room rushed in, a physical weight that pressed against his eardrums. He stood in the center of the room, gasping. "Who's there?" he whispered, breaking Rule 2. The archive didn't answer with words. Instead, the 1,000 jars on the shelves began to vibrate in unison. A low, choral moan rose from the glass, a harmony of 1,000,000 forgotten screams and whispers. Elias scrambled to put the headphones back on, but as he did, he saw it, a shadow, darker than the surrounding gloom, detached itself from the end of the west wing and slid behind a shelf. It was tall, impossibly thin, and moved with a hitching, mechanical gait. The broken seal. Panic is a cold fire. Elias reached for the intercom button, slamming his thumb onto the sub-office trigger. "Mr. Thorne." Something is in the West Wing. Someone is out here. There was no response. Only the hollow hiss of an open line. Elias grabbed a heavy iron flashlight from the desk. He had to check. If an intruder was in the building, he was responsible. He stepped into the West Wing, the beam of his light cutting through the gloom. The jars here were different. They were wrapped in silver wire and sealed with wax. He found the source of the dripping sound. A large jar on the floor had shattered. The echo inside wasn't a ribbon of light. It was a puddle of black, ink-like fluid that was slowly crawling across the floorboards, defying gravity as it began to climb the legs of the shelves. Where the fluid touched the wood, the sound of weeping emerged not from the air, but from the wood itself. The building was beginning to mourn. Elias backed away, but his heel caught on something soft. He spun around, his light landing on a pair of discarded shoes. They were modern sneakers, worn and dirty. Inside them were a pair of socks. There was no body. It looked as if the person had simply been unzipped and removed, leaving their clothes behind. A sudden, sharp ting echoed through the floorboards. Elias froze. It was the sound of metal hitting metal. The basement bell. The resonance chamber. The bell didn't just ring, it sang. It was a high, crystalline note that seemed to bypass the ears and vibrate directly in the frontal lobe of Elias's brain. Rule 3, turn the volume to max, close your eyes, and do not move. Elias fumbled with the dial on his headset, cranking the active noise cancelling to its limit. The world became a pressurized tomb. He squeezed his eyes shut, leaning his back against a shelf. He could feel the vibrations through the wood, heavy, rhythmic thuds coming from the basement stairs. Thump. 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 Something was coming up. Something heavy. Something that didn't have a steady gait. He felt a draft of freezing air pass over his face, smelling of wet earth and copper. Despite the rules, he opened one eye. A figure was standing 3 feet away. It was Thorne, but his suit was tattered, and his skin looked like wet gray paper stretched over a skeleton. Thorne wasn't walking, he was being pulled by invisible wires. His jaw was unhinged, hanging open at an impossible angle, and from his throat, the sound of the basement bell was emanating. Thorne's eyes were gone, replaced by 2 small, glowing ribbons of violet light. He turned his head toward Elias, the bell sound growing louder, more aggressive. Elias realized then that Thorne wasn't the manager. He was just another jar. The anatomy of a secret. Elias bolted. He didn't think about the rules or the pay, he ran for the iron door. But the layout of the archive had shifted. The hallways that should have led to the foyer now looped back into the heart of the shelving units. He ducked into a small side room, a restoration lab. On the tables were specialized tools, glass-blowing pipes, tuning forks the size of broadswords, and rows of empty jars. He found a ledger on the table, open to the final page. Project, the perfect mimic, the entry read. Human vocal cords are the only instruments capable of containing the primal echo. The transition is painful, but the result is a perfect preservation of the soul's frequency. We need a new vessel by morning. Elias looked at his own hands. They were shaking so violently he could barely hold his flashlight. He wasn't a monitor. He was a replacement. The high hourly wage wasn't for his time, it was for his biology. The archive didn't collect sounds, it harvested them from the living. The door to the lab creaked. Thorne, or the thing wearing him, was leaning against the frame. Elias, the creature whispered, but it wasn't Thorne's voice. It was Elias's own voice, perfectly pitched, except for the underlying metallic ring of the bell. Why are you running from yourself? The sound of the sun. Elias grabbed a heavy tuning fork from the table. As the Thorne thing lunged, Elias struck the fork against the metal edge of the table and thrust it toward the creature. The vibration hit the thing like a physical blow. The violet lights in its eyes flickered, and it let out a dissonant shriek that shattered 3 jars on the nearby shelves. The released echoes, a chorus of 1920s jazz and a 1950s nuclear test siren, collided in the air, creating a vacuum of sound that threw Elias across the room. He scrambled up, his ears bleeding from the pressure. He realized the only way out was down. The basement wasn't just where the bell was, it was where the primal echo was housed. If he could disrupt the source, the whole archive might lose its grip on this reality. He found the service elevator and slammed the button for the basement. As the lift descended, the temperature plummeted. The walls of the elevator shaft were lined with human hair, millions of strands vibrating in the dark, acting as a natural dampener for the horrors below. The heart of the archive. The basement was a vast, circular chamber. In the center sat a single, massive jar the size of a diving bell. It wasn't made of glass, but of a translucent, pulsing material that looked like living membrane. Inside was a swirling vortex of pure, blinding white sound. This was the primal echo, the first sound ever made, a scream of creation that had never stopped. Surrounding the jar were dozens of keepers, figures in tattered suits, all standing in a circle, their mouths open, silently feeding the central jar with their own residual life force. Thorne was there, or what was left of him. He stood at the base of the jar, his skin beginning to dissolve into light. "It's hungry, Elias," the collective voices of the keepers whispered into his mind. "The archive must be fed. You have such a beautiful, resonant voice. Think of the things we can do with your screams." Elias looked at the massive jar. He noticed a series of pressure valves at the base. If he could overtune the frequency, he could cause a resonance cascade. He reached for the dial, but the shadows in the room rose up to meet him. The final recording. The shadows wrapped around Elias's limbs like cold silk. He was dragged toward the central jar. His headset was ripped away, and for the first time, he heard the true sound of the archive. It was a roar of a billion lives lived and lost, a cacophony that threatened to turn his brain to liquid. He felt his own voice being pulled out of his chest, a glowing ribbon of gold light beginning to leak from his lips. With the last of his strength, Elias kicked out, his heavy work boot catching the main glass seal of the Primal Echo's jar. He didn't break it, not yet, but he cracked it. The sound that escaped the crack was a frequency that didn't belong in the physical world. The keepers disintegrated instantly, turned to ash by the sheer volume of the truth. Thorne's body vanished, leaving only the two violet ribbons of light to drift away like smoke. Elias crawled toward the crack, his vision failing. He pulled a small, portable recorder from his pocket, a lucky charm he'd carried for years. He turned it on and shoved it into the crack. "If you're hearing this," he gasped into the recorder, "don't take the job." The handoff. The archive began to fold in on itself. The shelves in the upper floors were collapsing, jars shattering by the thousands, releasing a tidal wave of sound that leveled the Victorian structure. Outside, in the city, people woke up in their beds, hearing the sudden sound of 1,000 thunderstorms, a million laughs, and a single, piercing scream that seemed to come from the sky itself. As the sun began to rise over the skyline, the building at the center of the chaos was gone. In its place was an empty, charred lot. A young woman, desperate for cash and clutching an eviction notice, walked past the lot. She stopped when she saw a glint of gold in the ash. She reached down and picked up a heavy skeleton key. Next to it lay a pair of crushed, matte black headphones. Suddenly, a man in a scorched charcoal suit stepped out from the shadows of the neighboring skyscraper. He looked at her with eyes that seemed a bit too bright, a bit too violet. "Are you looking for work?" the man whispered, his voice sounding suspiciously like a young man named Elias. "The pay is excellent. We just need someone to listen." The woman looked at the key, then at the man. "What's the job?" The man smiled, and for a split second, the sound of a distant, basement bell echoed in the wind. "Silence," he said. "We're looking for someone who knows how to keep a secret." The woman followed him into the shadows, and the city returned to its restless, noisy life, oblivious to the fact that the archive had just found its newest jar.